I've been casually trying to get through all of the Redwall books over the past couple of years, and I'm only just on book 6. Of course, I'm reading lots of other things, and I haven't, been doing nothing but reading these books. But, I bought Barton the Warrior, and I am currently reading it, and I hopefully will be able to get through it soon. But something that always bothered me about this one, and kind of bothered me about the series in general, is just the really weird lack of focus on continuity, even when it comes to reoccurring characters, especially when it comes to like the overarching main character of the entire franchise, Martin the Warrior himself, who is, of course, probably the only character that's mentioned in pretty much every Redwall book, virtually every Redwall book, maybe like some of the ones in the distant past he isn't mentioned, but generally speaking, Martin is probably the most important plot critical, lore critical character in the entire thing. And it's really weird reading Martin the Warrior again and kind of like getting back into this, because I loved this as a kid because of the darker tone and the ending in particular. I remember being like shocking, but reading it again, it really feels, well, even as a kid, I felt this way. It feels very odd seeing what Martin's like childhood was actually like, right? Because in Mossflower, he gives this story, which apparently is completely fake, where where he talks about like, oh man, I was a warrior. I lived in caves in the north and fought off sea rats with my dad. I did this and that. And like, I stayed there until, dad just left one day. And then I lived there for a couple of seasons and then just left. Right, that's the story he tells at the beginning of Mossflower, right? And it's really, if you're like me and like don't necessarily read Martin the Warrior right away, like you kind of just assume that it's completely 100% true, right? Like that's what happened, right? But then you like actually read Martin the Warrior, book 6, and then you get like what actually happened, where Martin, little kid Martin gets kidnapped by pirates and is like forced to be a slave for quite a long time. Like he gets his grandmother killed. Well, he doesn't get her killed, right? Like, they get kidnapped together and like, the grandmother dies and he's just like, enslaved. And, it's radically different from what he like the story he tells Gomp at the beginning of the Mossflower. And it's just such a weird thing. Right. Yeah, I think they try justifying it because, like, he really, really doesn't like talking about Rose. I think that's like the justification for it is that like he's just trying not to like speak of what happened in that point of his life. But it's like, okay, come on, why like make stuff up? Why make up something that didn't fucking happen? It makes your hero look kind of like an asshole when like his entire like personal history is completely just made up, right? Like, the friends he made at Redwall, by the time he like that abbey was built, like have a completely warped idea of who this person actually is, right? And again, I was thinking, like, reading this book again, of the story, Martin the Warrior might not actually be true, considering, like, some random people who come to the Abbey just, happen to have learned this story of Martin the Warrior and just happened to tell it to these people at Redwall Abbey, where Martin is a celebrity. It just feels kind of contrived. And I was kind of coming up with a conspiracy theory as I was like beginning to read this, and like, maybe this story isn't actually true because, Martin never acknowledges this in any of the books where he's a living character. Like it just comes off as if like, like this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Even though it is completely awesome, right? That is like the really annoying thing about these books sometimes is that like the continuity doesn't make a whole lot of sense, like at all. Like that you have like some weird character relationships that are never elaborated on, like like I want to say Gingivier, but like that's his last name. Like the cat from the first one, right? Who is implied to be descended from Gingivier from the second book. It's like, okay, like how exactly does that work? Like he's an ordinary house cat descended from wildcats. Like that's a thing that can happen in Redwall. Well, it doesn't make any sense, right? Like even though he has Gingivier's last name, like it just doesn't It doesn't make any sense. And like, of course, certain aspects are like written off or forgotten about or ignored or just like, like it's just the same thing over and over and over again in a lot of ways. And it's kind of frustrating if you're someone like me who really cares about like the continuity and stuff like this. Like you'll notice, like if you read these books like thoroughly, that like, yeah, there are these weird contradictions and things that don't really make a whole lot of sense and things that just kind of like are bungled, like when it comes to story. Like why exactly does Martin's sword like keep disappearing every like couple of years? Like, in the original book it's like some long lost artifact, but like, in future books, like they tell you, like they specifically write it down in like the logbooks that like, ooh, we hid this, we put this sword in this specific spot, and then they never really address it again. Like it's weird, right? The sparrows disappear after the third book, never to reappear again. Well, to be fair, they were like genocided. Like there are like, there are things like that, right? Where these books really should have paid more attention to like the continuity, right? You should have respected the kids reading this book now, because as an adult, I'm still salty. I'm still angry about some of this stuff, right? Like I'm still talking about it, right? And I really wonder, like, just how many examples of this are there? And I was actually thinking a while back that I would like to do, like, an entire blog post series, like, talking about some of these continuity problems. But maybe I'll just make it a video series instead. Like, just kind of, like, try and talk more about, like, these kind of topics in books. I don't know how much I can really add to this conversation, but I find it really interesting and would like to continue doing it.